Cairo, 1876, the Khedive of Egypt, Ismail Pasha, is sitting across a table from representatives of the British and French governments. He is not a weak man. He rules the most strategically important country in Africa, the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, the corridor that connects Europe to India and Asia, the site of the Suez Canal that his predecessor commissioned and that the world now cannot function without. His army is real. His revenues are real. His country is ancient and sophisticated beyond anything his European creditors can claim to match in terms of continuous civilization. But he has a number on a piece of paper that is larger than anything his treasury can cover. Egypt owes approximately 100 million pounds sterling to European bondholders, a debt accumulated over 2 decades of ambitious modernization projects, cotton speculation, and the catastrophic cost overruns of the Suez Canal construction. The interest payments alone consume more than half of Egypt's annual government revenue. There is no path to solvency that does not involve renegotiation. And renegotiation, as Ismail is about to discover, does not mean what he thinks it means. What it means is this: Britain and France appoint their own representatives to supervise Egyptian government finances. Egyptian tax revenues are pledged to debt service before any other expenditure. The Khedive retains his title and his palace. He loses his country. Egypt has not been invaded. No army has crossed its borders. No treaty of conquest has been signed. But the decisions about how Egypt spends its money, and therefore about what Egypt can build, maintain, defend, or develop, are now made in London and Paris. The debt is the mechanism of control. The loan that was supposed to build a modern state has become the instrument of its subordination. This is not an accident, and Egypt is not unique. Across Africa, between 1880 and 1914, the same mechanism operates with variations in detail, but consistency in outcome. A continent is colonized not primarily by soldiers but by bankers, and the debts that make it possible are often contracted by African rulers who are trying to build the very modernity that European lenders will use to control them. To understand what happens to Africa between 1880 and 1914, it is necessary to understand what is happening in Europe during the same period, because the debt trap that colonizes Africa is not a conspiracy hatched in a single room. It is the predictable output of a European financial system that has more capital than it can profitably deploy at home, and an ideology that tells it exactly where to send the surplus. Europe in the 1870s is in the middle of the Long Depression, a prolonged period of deflation and economic stagnation that follows the financial crash of 1873. Prices are falling, profit margins are shrinking. The industrial capacity that Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany have built over the preceding decades is producing more goods than European markets can absorb at prices that generate adequate returns. Capital is accumulating in the banks of London and Paris faster than domestic investment opportunities can absorb it. The solution that European financial institutions develop is export, not of goods, but of capital itself. Foreign loans to governments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America offer interest rates that European domestic investments cannot match, because the borrowing governments are desperate enough to accept punishing terms, and because the political risk of lending to foreign sovereigns is priced into a premium that makes the returns attractive, even accounting for the possibility of default. The ideology that accompanies this capital export is the civilizing mission. The Victorian conviction, held with genuine sincerity by many of its proponents, that European commercial penetration of Africa and Asia represents a gift of modernity to peoples who lack it. Railways will open the interior. Telegraphs will connect markets. European capital will fund the infrastructure that enables African producers to participate in the global economy. The loans are framed as development finance. The interest payments that follow are framed as the reasonable return on investment. The political control that enforces the interest payments is framed as the necessary governance that the borrowing states have failed to provide for themselves. The framing is self-serving, but it is not entirely dishonest. The railways are real, the telegraphs are real. Some of the infrastructure gets built. What the framing omits is the structural consequence. That infrastructure built with European capital on European terms, generating revenues that service European debt, is infrastructure that serves European commercial interests rather than African developmental ones. The railway from the coast to the interior does not connect African markets to each other. It connects African raw material sources to European export terminals. The direction of the track is the direction of the extraction. The debt trap works through a sequence that repeats across different African states with a remarkable consistency. Understanding the sequence is understanding the colonization. Step 1. An African ruler, a king, a khedive, a sultan, identifies a development need: a railway to move goods to the coast, a modernized army to maintain sovereignty against rival neighbors, a telegraph system to administer a large territory, an irrigation project to expand agricultural production. These are legitimate needs. The ruler's ambition to build a modern state is genuine. Step 2. European banks offer loans. The terms are presented as standard: interest rates of 6 to 12%, repayment schedules of 20 to 30 years. What is not presented clearly is the compounding arithmetic of these rates applied to large principal sums in economies whose revenue base is narrow and whose growth is uncertain. A loan of £1 million at 7% requires £70,000 in annual interest before a single pound of principal is repaid. If the project the loan funds generates less than £70,000 in additional annual revenue, and many of them do, the debt begins to compound immediately. Step 3. The project is built, often by European contractors at inflated costs, using European materials, employing European engineers whose salaries are paid from the loan proceeds. The loan capital flows primarily back to Europe in the form of contractor payments before it has touched the African economy in any structural way. Step 4. The revenue projections that justified the loan prove optimistic. The railway carries less freight than expected. The cotton harvest fails. The commodity price falls. The interest payment comes due and the treasury is short. Step 5. Renegotiation. The European creditors, now backed by their governments because the loans have been made to sovereign states, and default threatens not just private financial returns, but the political relationship between the lending country and the borrowing one, offer restructured terms. The restructured terms involve supervision. European financial controllers are appointed to oversee the borrowing government's revenue collection. Tax receipts are pledged to debt service before domestic expenditure. The borrowing government retains its name and its flag, but loses meaningful control of its fiscal policy. Step 6. The fiscal control, once established, extends naturally into political control. A government that cannot spend its own revenues without European approval, cannot maintain an army, cannot pay its administrators, cannot build infrastructure, cannot do the things that sovereignty requires. The debt has not conquered the country. It has simply made sovereignty impossible to exercise. Egypt is the template, the most complete and most documented example of the debt trap operating in its full sequence. The modernization begins under Muhammad Ali in the early 19th century and accelerates dramatically under his grandson Ismail, who comes to power in 1863 determined to transform Egypt into a European-style modern state. His ambitions are genuine and his projects are real. Railways across the Delta, the Suez Canal, a modern army, telegraph lines, schools, hospitals, an opera house in Cairo that opens in 1869 for the premiere of Verdi's Aida, commissioned specifically for the occasion. Ismail wants Egypt to be part of Europe, not subordinate to it. The cost is enormous. The Suez Canal alone, a project that takes 10 years to build and requires moving 74 million cubic meters of earth, costs vastly more than any pre-construction estimate suggested. Cotton revenues that had funded Egyptian development during the American Civil War, when Egyptian cotton substituted for the bloc's southern supply, collapse when American production resumes after 1865. Ismail borrows repeatedly, each loan at worse terms than the previous one, each round of borrowing compounding the debt that the next round must service. By 1876, the debt service is impossible. Ismail suspends payment. The European bondholders, primarily British and French, demand their governments intervene. The result is the dual control. British and French financial controllers appointed to supervise Egyptian revenues, with the right to direct tax collection and approve government expenditure. Ismail, who has refused to accept these terms fully, is deposed by the Ottoman Sultan at British and French instigation in 1879. His son Tufik, more compliant, replaces him. The debt control produces Egyptian nationalist resistance, the Urabi Revolt of 1881 to 1882, an uprising of Egyptian army officers and nationalist politicians who object to the subordination of Egyptian government to European creditors. The revolt is suppressed by a British military expedition in 1882. Egypt is occupied. What debt had not quite achieved? Full political control. Military force completes. But the military intervention is the product of the debt trap, not its origin. Britain does not invade Egypt because it wants to govern Egypt. It invades because the debt control it has established is threatened by political instability, and the revenues that service the loans must be protected. Egypt remains under British occupation until 1956. The debt that occasioned that occupation is paid off in 1943. The occupation outlasts the debt by 13 years because by the time the debt is cleared, the strategic and commercial interests that the occupation has generated are too valuable to surrender simply because the original financial justification has expired. Tunisia's colonization follows the Egyptian template so closely that it reads as deliberate imitation, though the sequence is produced by the same structural forces rather than any formal coordination. The Bey of Tunis borrows from European banks throughout the 1860s to fund military modernization and infrastructure. The terms are punishing. By 1869, Tunisia cannot service its debt, and an international financial commission, representing French, British, and Italian creditors, takes control of Tunisian revenues. The Bey retains his throne. The commission retains his budget. The political control that follows the financial control is organized by France, which has strategic reasons to prefer Tunisian subordination that go beyond the debt itself. In 1881, France invades Tunisia on the pretext of cross-border raids by Tunisian tribes into French Algeria. The Bey signs the Treaty of Bardo, which makes Tunisia a French protectorate. The debt was the mechanism of financial subordination. The military expedition is the mechanism of political formalization. Tunisia's flag survives. Its sovereignty does not. 1884, Berlin. 14 European nations gather at the invitation of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck to negotiate the rules of African colonization. The Berlin Conference does not plan the scramble for Africa. The process of European partition is already underway when the conference convenes. What it does is provide a legal and diplomatic framework for the partition, the principle of effective occupation, by which a European power must demonstrate actual administrative presence in a territory to claim sovereignty over it, and the rules for resolving conflicting European claims without going to war with each other. The conference produces the General Act of Berlin, which governs the colonization of Africa from 1885 onward. Not a single African ruler is present. The continent that is being divided is divided by the people doing the dividing, according to their interest, in a city 6,000 miles from the territories being allocated. The debt mechanism is not the only instrument of colonization. The Berlin Conference framework legalizes direct conquest and occupation in ways that go beyond what financial control can achieve. But financial control remains the preferred first instrument because it is cheaper than military conquest, more durable than military occupation, and more difficult to resist than armed force. A population can fight soldiers. It cannot easily fight interest rates. The colonies that emerge from the scramble, French West Africa, British East Africa, the Belgian Congo, German Southwest Africa, Portuguese Angola, and Mozambique, are administered through financial systems that ensure the extraction of value from the colonial territory to the metropolitan power. Tax revenues collected from African subjects pay for the colonial administration. Infrastructure built in the colony serves the extraction of raw materials. The labor of African workers produces the rubber, the cotton, the groundnuts, the cocoa, the copper that European industry processes and sells. The profit flows to Europe, the debt, where it exists, flows to European bondholders. The Belgian Congo is the debt trap's most extreme expression, and its most documented atrocity. Leopold II, King of the Belgians, presents himself to the Berlin Conference as a philanthropist, a monarch who wishes to bring civilization and free trade to the Congo Basin, suppressing the Arab slave trade and opening the interior to commercial development. The conference grants him personal sovereignty over the Congo Free State, an area 80 times the size of Belgium, in 1885. Leopold funds his Congo administration through loans and personal investment, constructing an apparatus of rubber extraction that is, in its commercial design, a masterpiece of coercive efficiency. Wild rubber grows throughout the Congo forest. Leopold's administration imposes rubber quotas on every village. Each community must deliver a specified quantity of rubber to the state post within a specified period. The Force Publique, a colonial military force of African soldiers commanded by Belgian officers, enforces the quotas. Villages that fail to meet their quota face violence, burning, hostage-taking, mutilation, the severing of hands, the detail that becomes the symbol of Congo atrocities when it reaches European public knowledge through the reports of missionaries and journalists in the early 1900s, is the enforcement mechanism's most visible consequence. Force Publique soldiers who fire their weapons must account for every cartridge with a severed hand, proving that the bullet was used to enforce the quota rather than wasted in hunting. The hands become currency in an accounting system designed to extract rubber at maximum efficiency and minimum cost. Between 1885 and 1908, when international pressure forces Leopold to transfer the Congo to the Belgian state, the population of the Congo basin falls by an estimated 10 million people. The deaths come from direct violence, from starvation, as food production is abandoned for rubber collection, from disease in a population already weakened by systematic exploitation, and from the flight of communities into the forest to escape the force publique. Leopold personally profits enormously. The rubber revenues fund his architectural projects in Belgium, parks, museums, urban improvements, while the Congo is consuming itself to pay for them. The Congo Free State is a debt trap with the intermediary step removed. Rather than lending money to a Congo government and extracting interest, Leopold simply claims sovereign ownership of the territory and extracts the value directly. By 1914, the European partition of Africa is essentially complete. Of the 50-odd territorial units into which Africa has been divided, only two retain formal independence. Ethiopia, which has defeated an Italian invasion at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, and Liberia, the American-sponsored settlement of freed slaves, which maintains a nominal independence heavily dependent on American political backing. The colonial economies that have been established across the rest of the continent share a common structure regardless of which European power administers them. They produce raw materials, rubber, cotton, groundnuts, copper, gold, diamonds, for export to European industry. They import European manufactured goods. The terms of trade consistently favor European manufacturers. Raw material prices fluctuate and trend downward as supply expands, while manufactured goods prices reflect the value added by industrial processing. The African producer sells cheap and buys expensive. The European manufacturer buys cheap and sells expensive. The gap between these prices is the structural mechanism of colonial extraction, operating continuously and automatically regardless of any deliberate exploitation. The colonial tax system enforces participation in this extraction economy. Africans who live in subsistence economies, growing their own food, producing their own goods, operating entirely outside the cash economy, are subjected to hut taxes and poll taxes payable in European currency. To pay the tax, they must earn currency. To earn currency, they must enter the colonial labor market, working on European-owned plantations in European-operated mines, or on the infrastructure projects that serve European commercial interests. The tax does not fund African development. It funds the colonial administration that collects the tax. The circular logic is exact. Africans work to pay taxes that fund the administration that enforces the work requirement. The economic consequences of this system are measurable, though the measurement is contested and the full calculation may be impossible. Africa in 1880 accounts for approximately 10% of global population and produces economic output roughly proportional to that share. By 1960, when the decolonization wave returns formal sovereignty to most of the continent, Africa accounts for a significantly smaller share of global economic output, despite a larger share of global population. The gap between Africa's demographic weight and its economic output is the colonial period's most direct legacy. The specific calculations are disputed. Economists who have attempted to quantify the net transfer of value from colonial Africa to European metropoles produce figures ranging from the very large to the staggering, depending on methodology and what is included. The direct extraction of raw materials, the unfavorable terms of trade, the taxation of African labor to fund colonial administration, the diversion of African agricultural land from food production to export crops, each of these is measurable individually. Their combination, sustained over 3 to 7 decades across an entire continent, produces effects that compound in ways that resist clean quantification. What is not disputed is the structural result. The colonial period builds infrastructure that serves extraction rather than development. It draws borders that divide ethnic groups and bind incompatible communities into single administrative units. It creates educated administrative classes that are trained to serve colonial systems rather than build independent ones. It extracts the revenues that might have funded African state capacity and redirects them to European bondholders and metropolitan governments. The independent African states that emerge from decolonization after 1960 inherit the borders, the infrastructure, and the debt of the colonial period, and begin their independence in the same position that their predecessors occupied in 1880. Holding loans that service European financial interests, producing raw materials at prices set in European markets, and governing territories whose boundaries reflect European administrative convenience rather than African political reality. The soldiers came eventually, but the debt came first. And in the places where the debt did its work most completely, The soldiers were almost unnecessary. The loan was the weapon, the interest rate was the blade, and the continent that borrowed to build modernity found that the modernity it built belonged to someone else.